All right, we are going to continue in Nehemiah. Um, One of the reasons that I chose Nehemiah is part of it is it's kind of a cool story, right? And sometimes we forget there's some really just cool stories of things that happen in the Bible, right? But this is a story that also has a lot of practical application of rebuilding things, of how things do get destroyed and crumble, and that can be in our own lives, it can be in our society, it can be in our family, right? That's what life is. Life is a roller coaster. It's full of ups and downs and challenges, but God is present through it all, and He is calling us always to rebuild, to continue to move forward. And Nehemiah is a great example of that. And so I'm enjoying just reading the story, but then always, well, how does that apply to us? It's not just a good story. The Bible is not just full of good stories. They are in there for a reason. One, because they happened. Right? That's important. Two, because this is God's word that He is revealing through these stories, through these things that happen. He's revealing who He is and who we are to Him and our relationship with Him. And it's revealing His ultimate plan of redemption, that God is always about redemption. And eventually there'll be that final redemption. But until then, it's just a pattern of God doing things to try to redeem us, to bring us back into relationship with Him. And then we screw things up and the walls get torn down, and then we experience the ramifications of that. But God doesn't give up on us, right? Sadly, many times we may give up on Him, but He doesn't give up on us. That's His ultimate redemptive plan is constantly working. And so I want us to, we're not going to do Nehemiah chapter 3. What happened where we left off? Nehemiah has now returned. He's kind of gone out. He's made his plan, right? And remember, he has those letters. We were introduced to these first two characters. The first scripture, Reese, is Nehemiah 2, verse 10. It's important. I want us to remember who these people are. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel. All right, so we saw that in chapter 2. Then we were introduced later, those same two figures. Also, it talks about the Arabs, the other people around, that they are getting a little uncomfortable with what's happening. And so then they actually start the rebuilding process. And I think I left my Bible in Sterling City, so therefore, yeah, it's all right. Magic of technology. And so chapter 3 shows us where the building process gets started, and it's frankly it's kind of dull reading because it's just all the names of these family groups, right? And they started working at this gate. This one started working at this gate. But actually, if these stories weren't true, if they were just made up, man, they went through a lot of work for chapter 3, right? Like, let's just make up all of these family names and randomly connect them with the sheep gate and the fountain gate. Like, were you just did you have a thesaurus and just pulling words out, right? Why would you do that if it's something that didn't happen? The reason it's in there is because it happened, right? And it makes sense. Nehemiah knew what he was doing. He gathered in all the priests. He gathered in all the leaders, which would have represented the different tribes, right? And then he would have said, you are responsible for this gate. You are responsible for that gate, right? There's organization to it. It makes complete sense. And we see that unfolding. So now the wall is starting to be rebuilt. And then we get to Nehemiah chapter 4, verses 1 through 9. Now, When Sanballat heard that they were building the wall, he was angry and greatly enraged, and he jeered at the Jews. And he said in the presence of his brothers and of the army of Samaria, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish up in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish and burned ones at that?" Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, "Yes, what they are building, if a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall." So he's kind of mocking the wall. Now this is Nehemiah in verse 4. "Hear, O God, for we are despised. Turn back their taunt on their own heads and give them up to be plundered in a land where they are captives. Do not cover their guilt, and let not their sin be blotted out from your sight, for they have provoked you to anger in the presence of the builders." So we built the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward, and that the breaches were beginning to be closed, they were very angry. And they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. And we prayed to our God and set a guard as protection against them day and night. All right. So what do we have happening here? We have a group of people that are represented by these two leaders, and they did have power. They were kind of governors of little provinces. These are people from that area that, and many of them, their descendants would have been pushed out of that area by Joshua coming in and conquering, right? And there were people groups around. The Samaritans, Sanballat probably was a Samaritan. They actually were within the same lineage as the Jews, right? Yet did not believe the same. There's no easy answers when you're talking about all of this, right? It's not easy. But there's, it would seem from our perspective, there's no reason that these groups of people shouldn't get along, because they all are very similar, right? They have similar backgrounds. They have similar stories. This was most of them were nomadic people. And then, throughout their history, all of those things, they shared all of that in common. They also are part of a fallen world. And within that fallen world, there has always been conquest. There's always been conflict between this people group and that people group. Sometimes it's justified. Usually we have no idea why it happens. It just happens. We're in a fallen world, right? But I think it was very interesting. And last week, as I was reading that in chapter 2, where it said they despised the fact that Nehemiah was coming to benefit the welfare of the people of Israel. And then we have even more where they start asking those questions. Isn't it interesting to me what the things that they have against the people? It doesn't make sense, right? It says, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it for themselves?" Right? So there's this, we don't want them to be able to restore that. We don't want them to be able to return to what they once were. Will they sacrifice? Right? Why should that matter to these other people? There's no reason, right? They can sacrifice to their gods. Why are they concerned that the Jews may be able to sacrifice to their God? Will they finish up in a day? How long is this going to take? Will they revive the stones out of the heap of rubbish? Right? And then it says, whenever they found that the wall was going forward, the breaches were beginning to be closed, they were very angry. And they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem, and to do what? And to cause confusion in it. So we're going to see that theme progress. And it's interesting how Nehemiah, and we'll see how he handles this moving forward as well. What's his first response? It's called an imprecatory prayer. That's a big word, right? But he is praying against his enemy, right? He is saying, God, keep them from succeeding. Because Nehemiah, he knows what their intentions are. Their intention is to keep them from rebuilding the wall, keep them from beginning to offer sacrifices and the restoration of their faith, essentially. That is what their goal is. And so Nehemiah unashamedly says, I don't want them to succeed. Right? And then it continues. And so what does Nehemiah do? He says, and we prayed to our God and set a guard as protection against them day and night. So he acknowledges, here's the reality. This is what we're up against. We have to deal with this. So we're going to push back, and we're not going to give up. Right? Now, to me, it's fairly simple just for us to understand what's going on back then in context of what's happening. Right? I can understand why those groups of people wouldn't want that kingdom to be restored because it was powerful before. Well, they wanted power, right? But where we get a little bit and can get a little maybe controversial and uncomfortable is when we start applying the principles that are clearly laid out here, applying that to today. And so we're going to do that. And it's not easy, but I think it is important. You know, the first thing that I think is vital for us to understand, and this is going to sound so simple, but I believe that our culture has completely misunderstood or chosen not to believe that this is true anymore. And what that is that there are those who are against the things of God. There are those who are actively engaged in trying to stop the things of God. There are cultures that are actively against the things of God. And that makes us really uncomfortable because we're very sophisticated Westerners. We've been around, the Western culture has now been around for 2,000 years, and we've got everything figured out. And our Ivy League schools have told us that all cultures are beautiful and holy, and they're all equal. Yeah, there's some differences, but all cultures are equal. All individuals are equal because they have been created in the image of God. All cultures have not been created in the image of God and are not equal, and some are demonic. That's the reality. We have decided to take the easy way. We have decided as a culture to emphasize that, no, God created, and if we even acknowledge God, right, that, well, God created and it was good. So everyone is inherently good, right? It's just their circumstances that lead them to do the things that they do. And I am not making this up. I am not mocking. This is what is taught in most of our higher education. And now they would take out God. They would just start with the fact that somehow we got here, right? With a big bang or an amoeba or something, right? That the atoms and the molecules became really smart and came together and formed us, right? But thankfully, they formed us all where we're good. And it's only the circumstances that you're in that would cause you to not act in a good way. Now, if you ask them the question, well, what is good? that starts going down some rabbit holes. And by what measure are things good? Because the Aztecs, they thought it was really good to sacrifice thousands of people to their god. They thought that was great. I disagree with that just a little bit. Why? Because my measure of good is not based on what I think is good. It's based on what God has said is good. Now, I understand that there are those who don't believe that, but there is a standard somewhere. We have decided, because we are so enlightened, and we certainly wouldn't want to offend someone of another culture, that has different beliefs. We do not want to offend them. And by the way, we shouldn't want to offend them. You know what they need? They need the redemption of Jesus Christ, right? And so we should not be rude and mean to other cultures. However, we can acknowledge that there are differences and that there are cultures out there that are directly opposed to the things of God. Now, does that mean that and this is where it gets hard. And I thought one of the things that's interesting, that this little group of people who are coming up against Nehemiah, one of the things that was their goal, says they were very angry. They plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem. So they're willing to actually fight, right? But also to cause confusion within it. The enemy's greatest weapon is confusion. And then you wrap us into our culture that has been highly influenced by a biblical worldview. Whether you like it or not, that's what our culture was built on. And there's a lot of positives about that. Right? But now we have abandoned that. We don't want to acknowledge that. And so there's lots of confusion. And then it makes it even harder whenever you're trying to actually be a Christian that listens to what Christ says. Because one thing that he does say is he says, love your enemy, doesn't he? Pray for those who persecute you. So we are in this weird place where it's like, well, how do we push back against things that we know are evil and at the same time love our enemies? And it is hard. And by the way, you should struggle with it a little bit. Right? You should struggle with that. But one of the things that we have allowed to happen, and we've allowed culture to start defining, is we, rather than understanding that when Jesus says love your enemy, he's talking about loving an individual who is against you. Loving someone who does not know the Lord. You should love that individual, and you should be praying for an opportunity to share the gospel message with that individual. God nowhere, Jesus nowhere says, do you love the ideologies of your enemy? You do not stand up and defend the ideologies of your enemy. Understand, there's two things. There's the big picture, right? And then there's the individuals. Love the individuals. Pray for them. Do all you can to bring them out of an ideology that may be blinding them to who Jesus Christ is. But we have to understand there are enemies out there. And I want to, so I know I talk about these things before, and I know that if you're still here, that you're not opposed to that. But I could come up with something every week from the headlines and just say, look how horrible things are, right? And sometimes I'm like, I don't like to do that. I really would just like to talk about how much God loves you, right? And there's really two commands that Jesus kind of summed everything up, right? Is to love God and to love others, right? And I would love to be able to just talk about how important it is to love others. But you know what? Our culture has started to make it to where the definition of loving others is that you affirm their ideology in order to love others. The problem with doing that is when that ideology goes against God, then you are not doing the first commandment. You love God first. and then you love others. That is very important for us to wrestle with. So you never compromise on the things of God in order to love others. You have to hold both of those in tension. And we live in a culture that is trying desperately to get us to quit loving God by emphasizing the importance of loving others. That is dangerous. That causes massive confusion. And it causes all kinds of rifts and challenges within the church, within our culture. But that's the place that we're in. So I didn't know how in depth I was going to go, and then someone got me all riled up by putting a Texas A&M thing on my pickup, and I was like, the hell with it, we're going all in, right? And so last week, I believe it was on Sunday, this picture was able to be taken. So this is from a video. And so it's a little blurry. This picture in many ways encapsulates what is going on in our country. So let's break this down a little bit. Last week, there was a group of Jews that have, for the last 2 years, have been marching peacefully. They don't even carry flags. They're just marching, remembering the hostages that were taken in October 7th. By the way, that still not all of them have been returned. That's all they're doing. They're not chanting things. That's what they've been doing for 2 years. One of them includes someone who was in a Holocaust camp. That individual was able to survive the gas chambers of Hitler, and yet in Boulder, Colorado, was set ablaze by a Molotov cocktail. Now, she lived. How does that happen? How is that possible? This is in Boulder, Colorado. So what you have is a picture of the person who did this. You have the charred evidence of Molotov cocktails being thrown that injured, I believe, 10, and I believe one has now died. And then just by happenstance, you have the courthouse in Boulder that has decided to fly a pride flag. Now, you may say, how does all that wrap together? See, there are a lot of ideologies that are represented here. And it's important that we understand the enemy that we face. The guy supporting the Palestinians, he's from Egypt, overstayed a visa at least 2 times. They knew that he overstayed the visa, and they still, our esteemed government still was like, no, it's okay for you to stay here. We know that he has been planning this attack for over a year. He was waiting for his daughter to graduate high school. This is not a crazy person, even though there's craziness involved here, yes. But it was planned. This wasn't a delusional, psychotic break. He knew exactly what he was going to do. In fact, he went and got his concealed handgun license and went and trained to learn how to use firearms, but was not able to purchase one because he wasn't a citizen. And so then he changed and he started researching Molotov cocktails and homemade flamethrowers. And the week after his daughter graduates from high school, he shows up, posed as a gardener, as he knew the route that the people were on. so that he could firebomb them. So that's an evil ideology that just hates the Jews. I don't fully understand that. There's cultural things with that. There's political. It's just ugly. It's just that level of hatred. And you can break all of that down, and people do. It's like, well, the Jews aren't always good. Yeah, because they're people, right? No one is always good, right? So, sure, can we criticize the nation of Israel for things that they do? Of course you can. In fact, are Jewish people very godly by and large today? This is lots of big statements here and generalization. But guess what? They're not. They've become very secular. Does that justify the level of hatred that is there? This is the same spirit that we just read about in Nehemiah. It's the exact same spirit. It's the exact same people group. It's there. And it infects our society as well, and we have to be on guard against it. At Truth Seekers on Tuesday night, showed some clips of Christian pastors that are really starting to get a little anti-Jewish. That's a really scary. But man, they're not woke. So, but it's like, yeah, but you know, the Jews don't really run the world. Okay, it's not true. There's this ideology of evil that causes confusion, causes chaos. But I do want us to talk a little bit about the background, because what allows other ideologies to come, I think, is represented in that picture. That flag could care less about any gay person, lesbian person, transgender person that is confused with their gender. That flag represents an ideology that hates them more than the largest right-wing bigot. They do not care about individuals within that community. Not at all. It is an evil ideology. And this is hard, because immediately this could get, if anyone's actually watching online, can get clipped and say, look at this person, he hates gays and he hates transgender and stuff like that. No. Our culture has decided we're going to marry the two, that you have to accept the evil ideology if you want to love the person who is caught in the ideology. That is not true. That flies in the face of all biblical truth. But that's then the place that we're in. I want to give just a brief history, because evil never sleeps. Sadly, the church has. The church slumbers at times. See, to fully understand the ideology that's represented in that flag, you actually have to go back to a guy named Karl Marx. And this is our modern understanding of the enemy, right? The enemy has always been there. Guess what? Just to break it to you, Sanballat was not reading Karl Marx when he hated the Jews, okay? But the spirit, the same demonic spirit, is the same. And so you have this guy, Karl Marx, that comes and he begins to create a theory, and it's based on structures and governmental structures and unfairness and inequity that we see that is real. And it begins to see everything through this lens of oppressor versus oppressed. So there are those who are favored, and then there are those who are not. And so you have groups in society that are oppressing the lesser than. And that at his time, that was focused primarily on economic things. It was, you have the elites who have all the money, and they oppress the poor. So that ideology starts to spread. And you can imagine, especially since the vast majority of people are, quote, poor. That's how it's always been, by the way. Always. People say, oh man, we live in a time where there's the haves and the have-nots, and there's just a few that are up here that have all the money, and then it's everybody else. Yeah, that's how it's been forever. You know why? Because we live in a fallen world that is sinful, and people are greedy, and people's human nature takes over. Right? You're not going to fix it, Carl. It's ridiculous. Right? But that's where it started. So if you're poor and you're being taken advantage of by the elite, that becomes a pretty, hey, I like this. And you can gain support really quickly. And so things started to progress. And we get into the early 1900s. And a guy named Lenin starts to come up. And he's from a country that is known as Russia. You may have heard of them. They actually, at this point, in the 1800s, there's a church known as the Russian Orthodox Church that is extremely powerful, extremely influential in Russia. Yes, they had czars. It wasn't a democracy like we think of a democracy in any way. But they are there. And that church does a lot of good things. There's a strong Christian element within the Russian society. Perfect? No. Is it ever? No. Lenin gets kicked out. He has to go back to Germany. Funny story. Gets in the middle of World War I. Lenin is spreading his Marxist crap over in Germany. And Germany's like, we don't want that stuff here. They literally smuggle Lenin back into Russia in order to cause what in Russia? Confusion. Because Russia is fighting against Germany. So they make it where Lenin goes back and he starts. And so by the end of World War I, Russia is tapping out, right? Because they're now in revolution. And that actually ends with Lenin taking power. So now you have what we call the communist Russia. The Soviet Union is born, right? What's the first thing Lenin does? Does he go and give big hugs to the Russian Orthodox priest? No, he puts bullets in their head. He burns the cathedrals. The church has to go underground. There are Russian Orthodox churches here in America that fled during that time. He does all he can to destroy everything religious, including mosque as well. Anything that is religious, because that's what Karl Marx knew was the enemy to his demonic ideology, is any form of Christianity. But we in the United States, we know that communism is bad. We would never open our doors to overt communism. A few years later, in Germany is known as very popular and well-known historical theologians. It is a strong Christian culture in the 1800s. If you go to seminary, you study lots of German theologians. But things start to change in Germany. In fact, the first transgender surgery is done in Germany in the 20s. Some of the first books that were burned were books that were encouraging the changing of all sexual ethics. And the society there was starting to be a pushback for that. And people were like, wait, where are we going? What's going on here? And then you had this rise of communism as well within the society. So what do you have? Confusion. And all of a sudden you get someone who uses the language of the Christian church to say, we'll push back on that. And they do. They actually burn some books of things that you would be like, yeah, those books probably need to be burned. But then that guy has no basis. in what is good and true and holy. He is just the opposite side of the coin of communism, just as Marxist, just labeled a little bit differently. Rather than focused on the wealthy and the poor, all of our ills are because of this people group, these Jews. And as Christians, the Jews, they're the ones who did what? They killed who? Jesus. And you all of a sudden, you began using the language of the Christian church, and yet you render it completely ineffective. The Christian church in Germany, during the rise of Hitler, about 20% of the churches went all in for Nazism. Only about 20% of the churches, they call themselves the confessing church, actually stood up and tried to speak back, led by a guy named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I've talked about him. He ends up getting killed in one of the camps right at the end. 60% of the churches just went along to get along. And Hitler was able to completely silence them. It was an ideology based on oppressor versus oppressed, but now connected with race. In the United States, we would never let overt fascism come in. We have a constitution. Oh, but the enemy never sleeps. And the enemy found a really powerful way, because in the 1900s and in academia, you started getting this idea called critical theory. It's basically applying the premise of Marxism, of that there is always an oppressed and there's always an oppressor. And you view people by groups. And so the way that you evaluate everything is which group is doing the oppressing and which group is being oppressed. So therefore, you elevate the one that is being oppressed. It can be applied to nearly anything. Critical queer theory began to rise. Critical queer theory examines how sexuality and gender identity intersect with power structures, often drawing on Marxist ideas about oppression and social constructs. It challenges traditional notions of identity and advocates for the destruction of societal norms, suggesting that both gender and sexuality are influenced by cultural and political context. It is a demonic agenda. And we, over the last 50 years, our courthouses have done all they can to get rid of the Ten Commandments, to get rid of any reference to being a biblical foundational nation. And now, what do you do whenever a group conquers another? What's the first thing they do? They fly their flag. We have been conquered subtly over years, where now we welcome the ideology that only brings death and destruction. It's an ideology that is shared by both of those images, by the man throwing the Molotov cocktail and the courthouse flying a flag that represents something evil. And you may say, well, wait, those groups, they can't connect, right? That guy would not support the flag. You're right. Yet, strangely, people who support that flag support that guy, but yet could not live in the country where that guy is from. And for most normal people, we go, what? That doesn't make any sense. Until you realize that both ideologies are serving the same master. That's right. That is why, for convenience sake, there will be some intersection. But guess what? The master behind those ideologies only wants to kill, steal, and destroy. So they will kill each other as well. I went a little longer than I was planning, but I think this is vital for us to understand in a reasoned, rational way as the church. because this is an enemy of God. And if we are going to love God, as Jesus said, we have to be against the enemies of God. We have to be against those types of ideologies. And we live in a place where being against those ideologies, people are going to say, and people in the church, a person that worked in churches I saw on Facebook on June 1st, right? It said, anti-LGBT equals anti-God. No, I am not anti any individual who identifies as one of those letters. In fact, my heart breaks for them because they have been deceived by an evil ideology. And we, as the church, have been complicit in that because we have not pushed back against the ideology in a healthy way. We have just been repulsed by it rather than actually trying to understand and trying to help those who are deceived by it. But we live in a world now. It is going to be a constant battle. And so what do we have to do? Maybe we do like Nehemiah. We pray and we put a guard out and we keep building. Understand the ideologies are not going to sleep. And we are called to go and rebuild what is good, what is true, what is beautiful in a culture that right now we are in crisis. The only answer to it is the redeeming love of Jesus Christ. And that is the message we have to go and present in the face of the evil ideology. And I believe we do have to call out the ideology. But it's tough and it's confusing because the enemy is powerful, but he's not all powerful. And the victory is in the Lord. And so when you start getting overwhelmed, step back. Make sure you redirect your focus not on those ideologies that are overwhelming, but put your focus on the one who overcomes. Put your focus on the one who empowers Nehemiah to rebuild the wall in the face of all that persecution and opposition. God has constantly helped us to rebuild even in the face of the greatest attacks. And that's where we are. But God has called you to this moment in history, and he will equip you to share his message of love in a world that is full of hate. Let's make sure we hold on to him and allow him to be our guard as we engage the darkness around us. Let's go to him in prayer.